Right now, in the state of Kentucky, there are roughly 16 million barrels of bourbon sitting in aging warehouses.
Yeah, which is just a staggering volume of liquid.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you do the math on that volume, that is enough liquid to provide a bottle to nearly every man, woman, and child in the United States.
Right.
And yet, if you walk into your local liquor store today, you're likely going to see empty shelves where the most sought-after bottles used to be.
Exactly. Or maybe a sign limiting customers to just one bottle per purchase for certain brands.
Yeah, so you have this retail environment defined by intense scarcity and allocation, but it's existing at the exact same time as a wholesale environment that is basically drowning in historic levels of physical oversupply.
The disconnect between those two realities is really the defining characteristic of the American whiskey industry at this very moment.
Welcome to this deep dive.
Mm.
If you're listening to this, you likely already know the names, right?
You know the bottles, you know the secondary market prices.
Yeah, and you're probably familiar with the standard mythology. The master distiller in the faded denim shirt, the limestone water, the sort of slow magic of the charred oak barrel.
But today, we have a comprehensive manuscript simply titled Bourbon, a Deep Dive. And our mission here is to discard that marketing folklore.
Exactly. We are not going to talk about unicorns or flavor drops today.
Yeah.
We are going to look at bourbon as a system.
A complex, highly unforgiving intersection of agriculture, chemistry, law, microclimates, and some pretty brutal delayed economics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the very physical and legal structures that create that flavor profile you recognize as bourbon.
Those are the exact same structures that make it a deeply dangerous, cyclical business.
Right. The mandatory delay that makes the liquid taste good is the very same delay that creates oversupply and cash strain.
So we need to build this system from the ground up, starting with the origin.
Yeah, let's start there.
Mm.
Because if you ask a casual drinker where bourbon came from, you usually get a story about a single inventor.
Someone like an Elijah Craig or Jacob Spears.
Right? Some guy having a flash of inspiration, deciding to char a barrel, and just inventing a new spirit. But the source material suggests that looking for an inventor fundamentally misunderstands how enduring food and drink categories are actually created.
Categories like this are never invented in a vacuum. They accumulate out of necessity.
Yeah, they evolve. And bourbon evolved directly out of the logistical realities of the late 18th and early 19th century American frontier.
Think about the settlers moving westward into Kentucky, Indiana, and those surrounding regions. The land was heavily forested, the soil was rich, and the highest yielding crop they could plant was corn.
But growing corn creates an immediate massive problem if you are a frontier farmer.
It's incredibly heavy.
Right. A standard bushel weighs about 56 pounds. It's bulky. It is susceptible to rot, to rodents, and to moisture.
And most importantly, you are sitting on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains.
Exactly. You cannot simply load thousands of pounds of raw corn onto a wagon and drag it over these primitive, muddy trails all the way to the eastern seaboard to sell it.
The transportation costs would completely exceed the value of the crop before you even reached a market.
The math of frontier agriculture just demanded a solution for that bulk.
Distillation was not some artisanal pursuit. It was an industrial compression algorithm.
That is a great way to put it. It's like zipping a large computer file. By fermenting and distilling that corn, a farmer could take a massive, highly perishable wagon load of grain and reduce it into a single, durable barrel of high-proof alcohol.
And that liquid did not spoil. It was far easier to float down a river on a flatboat.
And in a cash-poor frontier economy where, hard currency was exceedingly rare, a barrel of whiskey functioned as a highly liquid asset. Literally.
It was a monetized output of agriculture.
So early distilling was fundamentally a survival tool. It was a freight solution. But the people doing the distilling didn't just invent the process out of thin air, did they?
No, they brought existing knowledge with them. Migration patterns into the Ohio River Valley brought waves of Scottish, Irish, and Pennsylvanian settlers. And these groups had deep generational knowledge of distilling. But their traditional templates were based on barley and rye.
But when they arrived in Kentucky, rye was just harder to cultivate at scale compared to the native corn.
So they adapted the mash bill. They applied a rye distilling tradition to a corn-dominant landscape.
And the result was a spirit that retained some of that spice of the traditional rye, but carried a much heavier, sweeter, and fuller body from the corn.
Which brings us to the actual name.
Yeah, bourbon. The mythology really loves the idea of a founding father naming the spirit.
But the sources indicate the name was just a product of geography and downstream commerce.
Bourbon County, Kentucky was established in the late 1780s, and at the time it encompassed a massive swath of territory.
Farmers would load their barrels of corn-heavy whiskey onto flatboats and send them down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers toward the major port of New Orleans.
And those downriver merchants needed a way to distinguish the sweeter, corn-based whiskey from the spicier, rye-heavy whiskeys that were coming out of Pennsylvania or Maryland.
What's fascinating here is that they began referring to it by its geographic origin. It was the whiskey coming out of the Bourbon County region.
So the market actually named the product before the producers did.
Exactly. The identity stabilized because the commerce required legibility. Buyers in New Orleans learned that bourbon meant a specific flavor profile.
And that flavor profile was heavily influenced by the journey itself, right? Specifically the wood it was transported in.
The use of charred oak is perhaps the more defining characteristic of modern bourbon, but early on, cooperage was purely functional. Barrels were just the shipping containers of the era.
Yeah, whether early producers charred the insides of barrels to sanitize them after they held, like, fish or molasses.
Or whether they actively recognized that the layer of carbon smoothed out the rough edges of raw white whiskey.
The practical outcome was exactly the same. The clear distillate sat in that wood for months as it floated down to New Orleans.
The sloshing of the river journey forced the liquid in and out of the wood, extracting color and simple sugars.
By the time it reached the market, it had completely transformed.
And the consumers at the end of that river trade route started requesting the darker, smoother whiskey.
The market demand eventually dictated the production method. First came the agricultural necessity, then the logistical packaging, then the market preference.
And only much later did we apply reverence to the whole process.
Right. But once you establish a valuable trade good, once the name bourbon actually commands a premium in the market, you inevitably invite fraud.
The transition from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century is entirely defined by a crisis of trust.
Let's examine that crisis, because the 19th century spirits market was dangerously opaque.
You had the traditional distillers,
Yeah.
the people actually milling the grain, fermenting the mash, running the stills, and letting the liquid age in wood.
Which requires massive upfront capital and years of patience.
But competing against them, you had a shatter industry of rectifiers and compounders.
And a rectifier in the 19th century was essentially a blender and a flavor chemist,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, they would buy cheap, neutral, high-proof grain spirits, stuff often made very quickly and without any aging at all.
And to make this harsh liquid look and taste like mature bourbon, they would add coloring agents, things like burnt sugar or prune juice.
To simulate the bite or the complexity of a heavy spirit, they were known to add iodine, tobacco spit, or even small amounts of sulfuric acid.
Which is just wild to think about. They would bottle this concoction and sell it under the guise of authentic, aged whiskey.
So if you are a consumer standing at a bar in 1880, you have almost no way of knowing if the amber liquid in your glass is a carefully aged agricultural product.
Or a chemical cocktail mixed in a bathtub the week before.
The traditional distillers were losing the economic war. You simply cannot compete on price when your competitor just fakes the time and the wood you are paying for.
The traditional distillers needed to establish a perimeter. They needed a way to verify origin and process.
And the first major technological leap in this fight wasn't in the still, it was in the packaging.
Right. In 1870, a pharmaceutical salesman named George Garvin Brown introduced Old Forester.
What made it revolutionary was that he sold it exclusively in sealed glass bottles.
In our modern context, a sealed bottle is completely mundane. Everything comes in a sealed bottle.
But in 1870, this was a radical technology of trust.
Before this, whiskey was shipped in barrels, and a tavern owner would just fill a decanter or a glass directly from the wood.
That meant the tavern owner had the opportunity to dilute or doctor the barrel to stretch their own profit.
By putting the liquid in glass and sealing it at the source, Brown was making a direct, verifiable promise to the consumer.
He completely removed the middleman's ability to alter the product.
But a glass bottle only protected the specific brand. It didn't protect the category of bourbon from the rectifiers.
The straight distillers realized they needed the federal government to step in and create a legally enforced definition of reality.
And that lobbying effort culminated in the Bottled-in Bond Act of 1897.
Now, the Bottled-in Bond Act is often thrown around by bourbon enthusiasts today as a marker of quality, a sort of vintage aesthetic.
But reading the source material, it becomes clear this was a brutal piece of economic legislation designed to crush the rectifiers.
It was consumer protection via extreme structural rigidity.
To label a whiskey as bottled in bond The producer had to adhere to draconian rules.
The liquid had to be the product of one single distilling season, either spring or fall.
It had to be produced by one single distiller at one single distillery.
It had to be aged in a federally supervised bonded warehouse for an absolute minimum of 4 years.
And finally, it had to be bottled at precisely 100 proof. Let's break down why those specific rules matter so much.
The one season, one distiller, one distillery rule completely eliminates the rectifiers, who relied on blending bulk spirits from various unknown sources.
And the 4 years in a federally supervised warehouse rule meant the government itself was holding the keys to the building.
Ensuring that actual time was passing, not just a chemical shortcut being applied.
Right. And the 100 proof rule prevented anyone from stretching the yield by watering it down excessively before sale.
The government became the guarantor of authenticity, and this legal hardening continued.
Yeah, the Taft decision of 1909 further clarified what could be called straight whiskey versus blended whiskey.
And decades later, in 1964, a congressional resolution officially recognized bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States.
That 1964 resolution finalized the modern legal framework we know today.
And I want to pause on that legal framework because it is the engine of everything we will discuss regarding the economics.
Yeah, the law states that to be called bourbon, it must be made in the United States from a mash bill of at least 51% corn.
It must be distilled to no higher than 160 proof, entered into the barrel at no higher than 125 proof.
And crucially, it must be aged in brand new charred oak containers.
That final rule regarding new charred oak is the single most consequential regulation in the spirits world.
It's not just a flavor mandate, is it?
No, it is a forced capital expenditure.
If you make Scotch or Irish whiskey, you can buy used bourbon barrels and you can reuse them 3, 4, or 5 times.
The cost of your cooperage amortizes over decades.
But if you make bourbon, the law forces you to buy a brand new barrel for every single batch you produce.
You are legally required to maintain a massive continuous outflow of capital to the logging and coopering industries.
The law engineers the business model. It bakes a massive, inescapable overhead into the DNA of the spirit.
So having established the legal perimeter, we really need to look at the physical reality of how this liquid is actually made.
Because there is a persistent myth that bourbon is made in the barrel, that the wood does all the work.
But the mechanics show that the foundational architecture of the flavor is permanently locked in before the liquid ever touches the oak.
The wood provides the finish, but the grain, the water, and the yeast provide the structure.
It begins with the mash bill. The legal requirement of 51% corn provides the baseline sweetness and the textural body.
But the secondary grains, the flavor grains, are where distilleries define their distinct house style.
The traditional secondary grain is rye. Rye is aggressive.
It brings a spicy black pepper, herbal, and sometimes floral lift to the heavy corn.
But some producers choose a different path. The manuscript highlights Maker's Mark, which famously uses soft red winter wheat instead of rye.
Wheat lacks the aggressive spice of rye. It acts as a softening agent, creating a profile that is gentler, sweeter, and, as they describe it, never bitter or sharp.
Once you choose those grains, you mill them into a coarse flour and cook them to break down the cellular structure.
But to turn those raw starches into fermentable sugars, you need malted barley.
Yes. Barley that has been allowed to partially germinate produces enzymes, specifically amylase.
And those enzymes act as molecular scissors, cutting the complex starch chains into simple sugars that the yeast can actually consume.
You mix all of this with water, and here's where we hit another layer of Kentucky mythology.
Every brand talks about the magic of Kentucky limestone water. They market it as if it's a mystical elixir.
But what is the actual chemical function of the limestone aquifer?
It's entirely practical chemistry, isn't it?
Exactly. The limestone shelf beneath Kentucky does 2 things. First, it acts as a massive geological filter that removes iron from the water.
And iron is the enemy of distillation. If you have iron in your mash, it will react during fermentation and distillation, turning the liquid black and giving it a metallic, blood-like taste.
Second, the limestone imparts calcium and magnesium into the water. Those minerals are vital nutrients for the yeast.
Which brings us to the yeast, the biological engine of the entire process.
This is where bourbon production briefly resembles a highly specialized brewery.
Distilleries guard their proprietary yeast strains with intense paranoia. Some keep cryogenic backups in multiple facilities.
So why is a specific strain of yeast so critical if its only job is to eat sugar and excrete alcohol?
Because alcohol is only the primary metabolite. As yeast consumes the sugar, it undergoes metabolic stress.
And that specific strain of yeast, combined with the temperature of the fermentation and the mineral content of the water, causes the yeast to produce secondary compounds.
Congeners and esters.
Esters are volatile flavor compounds. One yeast strain might produce a high volume of isoamyl acetate, which smells remarkably like bananas.
Another strain might produce ethyl hexanoate, which smells like green apples or pineapple.
So the heavy fruit notes or the floral aromatics you smell in a finished bourbon are not coming from the corn or the wood.
They are the biochemical exhaust of a specific highly stressed fungal colony.
And the critical next step is ensuring those delicate esters actually survive the distillation process.
The law mandates that bourbon cannot be distilled to higher than a 160 proof.
Wait, explain why that ceiling matters to the listener. Why cap the distillation proof?
Well, think about what distillation actually is. You are heating the fermented mash to separate the alcohol from the water and the solids based on their different boiling points.
If you run a still incredibly hot and efficiently, distilling up to 190 or 195 proof, you strip away almost everything except pure ethanol.
You create vodka. It is highly efficient, but it is neutral.
By legally capping the distillation at 160 proof, the government ensures that the process remains relatively inefficient.
And that inefficiency means a heavy load of the grain oils, the yeast esters, and the congeners are carried over into the final distillate.
The spirit retains its agricultural and biological identity.
So fresh off the still, you have a completely clear liquid, commonly called white dog. It looks like water.
But if you taste it, it is incredibly complex.
I look at this clear spirit like the poured concrete foundation of a house. The yeast, the grains, the water, and the distillation proof have set the permanent dimensions.
The barrel is going to be the framing, the drywall, and the paint. It will make the house look like a house.
But the foundational footprint, the absolute limit of what that house could eventually become, is locked in that clear liquid.
The barrel can only interact with the chemical precursors that the distiller provides.
And before they put that clear spirit into the wood, the distiller makes one final, highly consequential chemical decision: the entry proof.
The law says the spirit cannot enter the barrel at higher than 125 proof.
So the distiller takes the 160 proof distillate off the still, and they add water to bring it down.
But some distilleries enter at 125, some at 115, some at 110.
Does a few degrees of proof really alter the final product that much? I mean, it is all going into the same wood.
It alters the extraction mechanics entirely. You have to view the liquid not as a single substance, but as a solvent containing both water and ethanol.
And water and ethanol dissolve different compounds within the wood.
Exactly. Water is highly effective at dissolving the water-soluble wood sugars, the caramel and toffee notes created when the barrel was charred.
And ethanol is much more effective at dissolving the lignans and tannins, the heavier, spicier vanilla and astringent compounds.
So if you enter the barrel at a lower proof, say 110, you have a higher ratio of water to ethanol.
That means you are going to aggressively strip the sweet wood sugars out of the barrel.
But if you enter at the legal maximum of 125, you have more ethanol, so you will extract more of the heavy tannins and vanillins.
You are dialing in the extraction ratio on day one.
Precisely. It is a long-term chemical commitment made before the barrel even rolls into the warehouse.
And once it does roll into the warehouse, the spirit enters the most complex, dynamic, and misunderstood phase of its life.
The active microclimate of the rickhouse.
This is where we need to completely rethink what aging actually means.
When people think of aging, they usually picture wine in a cellar, a cool, dark, totally static environment where the liquid just sits quietly and rests.
Bourbon aging is violent. The barrel is not a storage unit. It is an active, breathing ingredient.
To understand the violence of the process, you have to look at the anatomy of the barrel.
By law, it must be new white oak.
And white oak is chosen because its cellular structure contains tyloses, which act like microscopic plugs that prevent the liquid from leaking out.
But before the barrel is filled, the interior is subjected to intense fire. This charring process alters the chemistry of the wood.
The intense heat breaks down the hemicellulose into simple wood sugars. It breaks down the lignin into vanillin and spice compounds.
It leaves a layer of pure carbon char on the surface.
So you have this chemically primed vessel, and you fill it with the clear, high-proof solvent.
And then you subject it to the aggressive, seasonal swings of the Kentucky climate.
It gets brutally hot and humid in the summer and freezing cold in the winter.
What is that temperature swing actually doing to the liquid inside?
It is creating a thermodynamic engine. As the ambient temperature in the warehouse rises during the summer, the liquid inside the barrel warms and expands.
The vapor pressure increases, physically forcing the whiskey deep into the cellular structure of the wood.
Past the carbon char and into the heat-transformed red layer where those sugars and lignins reside.
The solvent dissolves those compounds, and then the winter comes.
The temperature drops, the liquid cools and contracts.
The pressure drops, and the whiskey is pulled back out of the wood, bringing the dissolved flavor compounds and the deep amber color with it.
This cycle happens year after year. The barrel is literally breathing the whiskey in and out.
This means the physical location of the barrel within the warehouse is just as important as the recipe.
A traditional Kentucky rickhouse is massive, sometimes 7 or 9 stories tall, clad in thin metal with no climate control.
It is a vertical thermal map. Heat rises.
On the top floors of a traditional rickhouse, the summer temperatures can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
And the humidity is often very low up there. In that environment, the breathing cycle is extremely aggressive.
But something else happens. Evaporation.
Because the environment is hot and dry, water molecules, which are smaller than ethanol molecules, escape through the pores of the wood faster than the alcohol does.
So the water evaporates, leaving the alcohol behind.
That means on the top floors, the proof of the whiskey actually goes up as it ages. It gets hotter, spicier, and more concentrated.
Conversely, look at the bottom floors. Down near the dirt, the air is cool and damp.
The temperature swings are much less severe, so the breathing cycle is slower and more delicate.
Furthermore, because the ambient humidity is high, the water inside the barrel doesn't evaporate as easily. Instead, the ethanol evaporates faster than the water.
So on the bottom floors, the proof actually drops over time. The maturation is slower, and the resulting profile is often softer and more rounded.
This creates a profound reality about age statements. The manuscript cites Buffalo Trace's Warehouse X, a specialized facility built to isolate variables like temperature, airflow, and humidity to study their effects on maturation.
The industry knows that the warehouse is a production variable, not just a storage space.
Right.
Let me put this in perspective for you. You could take 2 identical barrels filled with the exact same clear spirit on the exact same day.
You put one on the top floor by a sun-facing window, and you put the other in the cool, damp center of the bottom floor.
You leave them both alone for 7 years. When you tap those barrels, the top floor barrel might be a fiery, deeply extracted 130 proof monster.
The bottom floor barrel might be a gentle, floral 105 proof sipper.
They're both exactly 7 years old, but they taste like completely different products.
Age is merely a coordinate on a map. It is not the territory itself.
The calendar alone cannot tell you what the barrel has become. The thermal life of the barrel dictates the flavor.
But this dynamic breathing environment doesn't just extract flavor, it extracts volume.
We mentioned evaporation, and this brings us to the most brutal economic reality of the bourbon business.
The breathing that makes the liquid taste good is physically destroying the inventory.
The industry romanticizes this loss by calling it the angel's share. The idea that the angels take a small percentage of the whiskey up into the heavens.
But if you are a chief financial officer, the angels are a massive liability.
In strict economic terms, the producer is paying heavily to hold an asset that physically shrinks every single day it sits in the warehouse.
Let's run the math on this, because this is where the romance of the denim shirt really dies.
If you are a bourbon producer, you manufacture a product today, but you legally cannot sell it for years.
In the case of premium bourbon, you might not sell it for a decade or more.
During that entire decade, your capital is locked up. You had to purchase the grain, run the still, and buy the expensive, single-use, new charred oak barrel.
That capital is gone, sitting in a warehouse.
And while you wait to see a return on that capital, the carrying costs compound.
You have to maintain massive real estate footprints to hold these millions of barrels. You have to insure them against fire and tornado.
And historically, in Kentucky, you have been subjected to an ad valorem property tax on the barrels themselves.
You pay a tax on the inventory every single year it sits there.
So your costs are rising exponentially year over year, but simultaneously, the volume of your product is dropping.
You lose roughly 3 to 5% of the liquid volume per year to the angel share.
Over a decade, a barrel might lose 30, 40, or even 50% of its original volume.
I want you to really internalize this business model.
Imagine running a tech company where your servers legally shrink by 5% every year, but the government taxes you on them, and you can't sell your software until 10 years from now.
Hoping people still use that operating system. It is an astonishingly hostile economic structure.
This structural hostility explains the vast economic difference between a standard 7-year-old bourbon and a premium 15-year-old bourbon.
They're not just different ages, they represent entirely different risk profiles.
A 7-year-old barrel still offers commercial flexibility. It has lost some volume, but it retains a solid yield.
The carrying costs are manageable. If the barrel profile isn't perfect, it can easily be blended into a large batch for a flagship product.
But if a distiller decides to leave a barrel in the wood for 15 years, they were taking a massive financial gamble.
The compounding math becomes terrifying. The evaporation has taken a massive toll on the yield. You might only get half the bottles out of that barrel compared to a younger one.
You have paid 15 years of taxes, insurance, and storage. And the most dangerous variable is the chemistry itself.
The risk of over-oaking.
Exactly. Time does not equal guaranteed quality. Wood is an organic, unpredictable material.
After 15 years of the thermal cycle, a barrel might push past the sweet spot.
The liquid can extract too much tannin from the wood, becoming dry, bitter, and astringent. It tastes like chewing on a piece of lumber.
The producer has paid for a decade and a half of carrying costs, absorbed massive volumetric loss, and the resulting product is completely unsellable.
The source material phrases this brilliantly. Age is a narrowing funnel.
As time goes on, the pool of surviving high-quality liquid shrinks, while the probability of stylistic failure rises.
So when a consumer looks at a 15-year-old bottle on a shelf with a $300 price tag, they might think they're just paying for the rarity of older flavor.
But they aren't. They are reimbursing the distiller for the years invested in a shrinking asset.
And they are subsidizing all the other barrels in the warehouse that failed to make the cut.
It is an inventory, finance, and probability problem. The distiller is making a bet today on what the consumer palate will demand 10 years from now.
Which begs the critical question. What happens when the industry makes a bad bet?
What happens when you spend a decade filling rickhouses with a heavy, sweet spirit, and by the time it matures, the consumer wants something completely different?
History provides a very clear, very painful answer. We have to look at the first great bourbon bust.
To understand the severity of the bust, you first have to understand the height of the peak.
Following World War II, bourbon entered a golden era. It was deeply integrated into American culture.
It was the drink of executives, of politicians, of the working class.
By the early 1960s, it was the top-selling liquor category in the country, culminating in that 1964 congressional resolution declaring it America's native spirit.
If you are running a distillery in 1965, the data tells you that bourbon dominance is a structural, permanent fact of American life. Demand is high, growth is steady.
So what do? You run the stills.
You fill millions of barrels, assuming that when they are ready in 1975 or 1980, a thirsty market will be waiting.
But consumer categories rarely hold their dominance forever. As the culture shifted radically through the 1970s and into the 1980s, tastes changed.
The younger generation actively rejected the symbols of their parents' era.
And bourbon was firmly viewed as your grandfather's drink. It was perceived as heavy, old-fashioned, and entirely out of step with the times.
The market pivoted toward lighter, mixable spirits. Vodka exploded in popularity.
It was marketed as clean, modern, and odorless. At the same time, wine gained immense social prestige.
The bottom completely fell out of the brown spirits market.
This is where the delayed nature of the bourbon production cycle turns a market shift into a catastrophic glut.
The whiskey glut of the 1970s and 80s was the physical manifestation of delayed overconfidence.
The industry had spent a decade turning millions of dollars of grain and wood into inventory for a demand that completely evaporated.
If a modern fast fashion company manufactures a line of jackets that nobody wants, it hurts. But they discount the inventory, clear it out, and design a new line for the next quarter.
They pivot. But bourbon cannot pivot. A distiller's miscalculation sits in a rickhouse, locked in 300 pounds of oak, generating property taxes every single year.
You cannot undo the distillation.
The industry was paralyzed. Warehouses were bursting with mature whiskey, and there were no buyers.
Pricing plummeted as desperate brands tried to liquidate inventory. The result was a bloodbath of consolidation.
Historic distilleries closed their doors. Stills were dismantled. Brands were sold off for parts or allowed to die entirely.
The surviving companies had to rely on sheer scale or diversification into other spirits to stay afloat.
It was a true dark age for the category. But out of this dark age came a fascinating, accidental silver lining that entirely dictates modern collector culture.
Because nobody was buying the whiskey, the distillers simply stopped bottling it. They left it in the wood.
They had no choice. Bottling requires glass, labels, and labor. More capital outlays for a product that wouldn't sell.
So the barrels just sat there, aging far beyond their intended maturation dates.
This desperation accidentally created the ultra-aged, legendary stocks that formed the foundation of today's secondary market.
The manuscript mentions places like the old Stitzelweller distillery. During the glut, they were sitting on incredibly old, wheated bourbon.
What modern collectors now view as liquid gold was, at the time, viewed by accountants as illiquid, toxic inventory. It was a liability.
But decades later, when tastes shifted again, those forgotten barrels provided the incredibly complex, mature profiles that proved bourbon could rival the finest scotches or cognacs.
The irony is staggering. If you look at the secondary market today, collectors fetishize the dusty bottles from the 1980s and early 90s.
They pay astronomical sums, convinced these bottles represent the pinnacle of deliberate craftsmanship.
They completely miss the reality that those bottles only exist because the industry was bleeding to death.
The extreme age was a symptom of economic failure, not a master plan.
It is a retrospective romance applied to a historical crisis.
Yeah.
A bust of that magnitude teaches an industry an agonizing lesson about the dangers of overproduction.
The survivors learned to be disciplined, to plan conservatively, and to fear the delay of the barrel.
But unfortunately for the industry, wild success is the enemy of institutional memory.
When bourbon finally rose from the grave, the sheer euphoria of the boom made everyone forget the brutal math of the glut.
Which brings us to the modern revival.
The revival began as a slow burn in the early 2000s and rapidly accelerated into a massive boom in the 2010s.
Several cultural threads converged simultaneously. The classic cocktail revival brought bartenders back to historical recipes, which demanded high-quality American whiskey.
The broader culinary movement taught consumers to value provenance, heritage, and the story behind their food and drink.
And the industry successfully turned the distilleries themselves into massive tourism engines.
The category was completely revalued. People weren't just drinking bourbon, they were identifying with it.
But the real accelerant, the gasoline poured on the fire of the revival, was the evolution of scarcity marketing.
The language and behavior of the consumer completely shifted. They moved from casual consumption to aggressive acquisition.
The culture adopted terms like hunting, allocations, and drops.
Consumers were trained by a combination of brand marketing and internet forums to equate retail rarity with liquid greatness.
If a bottle required a lottery to purchase, the perceived value skyrocketed.
Buffalo Trace is the ultimate case study of this era. They possessed a beautiful heritage site, powerful branding, and a portfolio of recipes that perfectly hit the modern palate.
The consumer demand for their allocated labels brands like Blanton's, Weller, and Eagle Rare became absolutely insatiable.
These bottles transitioned from being beverages to being social signals and speculative assets.
But the retail scarcity of those specific labels created a profound cognitive illusion for the broader market.
Consumers felt a generalized shortage because they couldn't find a few hyper-allocated brands.
But if you look behind the curtain at the macro-level capital expenditures, there was no shortage. There was a historic, unprecedented expansion.
The manuscript highlights the staggering scale of this expansion. While consumers were waiting in line at dawn for a single bottle, Buffalo Trace was quietly executing a $1.2 billion expansion.
They built 19 massive new aging warehouses. They recently filled their 9 millionth barrel since Prohibition.
They were scaling up at a rate that defied the concept of scarcity.
And this expansion wasn't isolated to one company. The entire industry was caught in a production frenzy.
We have to look at the data provided by the Kentucky Distillers Association. This data strips away the marketing and shows the terrifying physical reality of the boom.
By the end of 2024, the state of Kentucky held 17.1 million barrels of aging spirit.
17.1 million barrels.
And 16.1 million of those barrels are specifically bourbon.
Let me stop and contextualize that number. 16.1 million barrels.
A standard barrel holds roughly 53 gallons, yielding somewhere around 250 bottles after the Angel's share takes its cut.
We are talking about billions of bottles of whiskey sitting in warehouses in a single state.
But the total volume is only half the story. The age distribution within those 16.1 million barrels is the truly alarming metric.
Roughly 70% of that entire inventory was produced within the previous 4 years.
Conversely, only about 3% of the inventory is older than 8 years.
I want you to grasp the friction here. If you are a consumer who has to visit 5 different stores just to find a standard bottle of allocated bourbon, Your lived reality is scarcity.
So how can the industry possibly be facing an oversupply?
Because the scarcity is localized to a handful of mature, hyper-hyped labels that rely on that 3% of older stock.
But the oversupply is structural across the entire category.
The boom was essentially a massive economic forecast embodied in wood, driven by the enthusiasm and the sky-high pricing of 2019 through 2022. The industry assumed that the premiumization trend would scale indefinitely.
They assumed the market could absorb infinite volume.
So they fired up the stills and filled millions upon millions of barrels, creating a demographic bulge of young whiskey.
And now that mountain of 16 million barrels is marching steadily toward maturity.
They are sitting in the rickhouses right now, breathing in the oak, evaporating volume, and racking up property taxes and insurance costs.
In the next few years, those barrels must be bottled and sold. They must find buyers.
But they are reaching maturity at the exact moment the macroeconomic winds are shifting aggressively against them.
The delayed bid is coming due, and the consumer is pulling back. Welcome to the new bust.
The data signals a very clear, very dangerous cooling of demand. According to the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, American whiskey sales totaled $5.1 billion in 2025.
That represents a drop of 0.9% from the previous year.
Now, let me challenge that for a second. A drop of less than 1% doesn't sound like a catastrophe. In most industries, flat sales are just a plateau.
Why is a 0.9% drop a crisis for bourbon?
Because the bourbon business model is built entirely on years of forward production based on anticipated growth.
Those 16 million barrels were not laid down to service a flat market. They were laid down with the assumption of aggressive compounding growth.
When you build infrastructure for a 10% annual expansion and the market suddenly contracts by 1%, the physical pipeline instantly backs up.
The outlet valve is closing, just as the massive wave of supply is hitting the end of the pipe. And this isn't just a domestic problem.
It is a global contraction. The U.S. spirits export data is grim. Exports fell 9% in the second quarter of 2025.
Shipments to Canada, which is a massive, highly reliable market for American whiskey, plunged by an astonishing 85%.
The demand is evaporating, but the carrying costs are not. We talked earlier about the Kentucky barrel tax.
The KDA reported that distillers were facing a crushing $75 million aging barrel tax tab. That tax burden is up 163% over just 5 years.
The sheer cost of holding this maturing inventory is draining capital from the producers.
This is the critical moment where a commercial slowdown mutates into a severe financial crisis.
During the boom, banks and private equity firms viewed a warehouse full of maturing whiskey as incredible collateral. It was an appreciating asset.
But when the market turns, that perception flips overnight. Those barrels go from being hidden value to illiquid inventory in search of non-existent buyers.
The lenders get spooked. And we are seeing the distress signals flashing across the industry right now.
The source materials outline several specific cases. Look at the Stoli Group bankruptcy case.
A bankruptcy judge actually rejected a restructuring plan specifically because the bourbon barrels they were using as collateral were deemed too shaky and volatile in an oversupplied market.
The banks are realizing that valuing a barrel based on 2021 secondary market prices is a fatal error.
We're seeing real casualties. Luca Mariano's parent company entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Garrard County Distilling fell into receivership.
These cases illustrate exactly what happens to highly leveraged new entrants when the music stops and the debt comes due.
But it is vital to note that this isn't just affecting the over-leveraged startups. The titans of the industry are actively pulling the emergency brake.
Jim Beam, arguably the most recognizable bourbon brand on the planet, announced a production pause at their main Claremont site for 2026.
Their stated reason was to assess production levels to best meet consumer demand.
That is corporate language for a profound realization. They have too much liquid and not enough demand to justify running the stills at full capacity.
When a company with the scale, distribution, and capital of Jim Beam voluntarily halts production, it is a definitive signal that the glut is real.
So if the pipeline is full, demand is flat, and the debt is coming due, what happens to the landscape of the industry over the next 5 years?
A downturn of this magnitude acts as a brutal sorting mechanism. The fantasy of an uninterrupted, infinite ascent is over.
The future is significant consolidation. The heritage brands, the strong, well-capitalized companies with genuine consumer loyalty, deep global distribution networks, and a diverse inventory of mature ages will survive.
They have the balance sheets to absorb the carrying costs, slow their production, and wait out the storm.
And if I am reading the mechanics of this right, those strong heritage brands are going to prey on the weak.
They will likely buy up the distressed barrels from the bankrupt startups for pennies on the dollar, dump them into large blends, and dominate the bottom shelf.
That is exactly how consolidation works in this industry. But for the smaller, newer producers who expanded aggressively during the boom using high-interest debt, they face a severe existential reality check.
If they try to sell their young barrels on the bulk market right now, they will get devastatingly low prices.
But if they try to hold the barrels longer, hoping for the market to rebound, their carrying costs compound, their taxes come due, and the angel share continues to shrink their yield.
They are trapped in the mechanics of the barrel.
The industry as a whole is being forced to relearn its oldest, most painful lesson. Bourbon is not a magical money printer.
It is fundamentally inventory aging under extreme uncertainty.
It is an incredibly sobering reality check. So let us synthesize this journey we have been on, because we have traveled far from the denim-shirted master distiller.
We started by breaking down the origin myth. Bourbon was not a sudden invention. It was an industrial solution to the logistical nightmare of the American frontier.
It was a way to compress heavy perishable corn into a durable monetized asset that could survive the river journey south.
We saw how the success of that asset invited fraud, forcing the traditional distillers to adopt new technologies of trust. From the sealed bottle to the draconian consumer protections of the Bottled in Bond Act.
Those legal standards hardwired massive capital requirements into the spirit, particularly the mandatory use of single-use new charred oak barrels.
We looked at the rigorous chemical mechanics required before the barrel is even filled, how the mash bill provides the architectural foundation, how the yeast strains endure metabolic stress to produce complex flavor esters, and how the legal distillation limits preserve those fragile compounds.
We explored the violent thermodynamic engine of the rickhouse, the extreme temperature swings that forced the solvent in and out of the wood, extracting flavor while evaporating volume.
We established that age is merely a coordinate, and that the physical location of the barrel dictates its thermal life and ultimate proof.
Which brought us face to face with the brutal economics of time, the inescapable reality of compounding storage costs, property taxes, and volumetric loss that makes aging a barrel for 15 years an exponentially riskier proposition than aging it for 7.
We watched the industry fail to heed these risks during the crushing whiskey glut of the 1970s and 80s, only to completely forget those lessons during the spectacular modern revival.
A revival that trained consumers to hunt for artificial scarcity, while producers quietly over-leveraged themselves to build an invisible ocean of 16 million barrels, leading us directly into the macroeconomic pressure cooker of the current bust.
Ultimately, the core lesson of the source material is profoundly ironic. The very mechanism that makes bourbon beautiful, the mandatory, inescapable passage of time in an active climate, is exactly what makes it a brutal, cyclical, and dangerous business.
The delay creates the flavor, but the delay also creates the glut. So to you, the listener, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
The next time you manage to secure a bottle and you pour a glass of bourbon, by all means, appreciate the craft.
Look for the tasting notes of vanilla, the caramel, the toasted oak, and the subtle fruit esters. But I want you to look deeper into that amber liquid and realize that you are drinking the result of a highly leveraged, long-dated financial gamble.
Think about the people who filled that specific barrel years ago. Think about what they assumed the world, the culture, and the economy would look like today when they finally tapped it.
Consider the incredible compounding risk they took, the taxes they paid, and the evaporation they suffered just to bring that single pour to your glass. And as you watch the industry navigate this massive mountain of oversupply in the coming years, ask yourself, when the dust finally settles and the debt is called in, whose names will still be standing on the shelf,